to your access point to Washington. I'm Aisha Tanseem. As Hurricane Sandy smashed into the eastern seaboard of the United States, leaving a trail of dead bodies, flooded cities, and billions of dollars of damage in its wake, some climate science experts hinted that it might be a sign of things to come. Let's take a look at Sandy and its fury. Tonight, we will discuss why some experts are suggesting that global warming might be responsible for the scale of Sandy, and what else should we be prepared for? And we have a great panel of experts with us. In our Washington studios, we have Dan Huber, who's a Science and Policy Fellow with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
Joining us on Skype from Lahore is Adil Najam, the current Vice Chancellor of LUMS, who served as a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for this work, the panel received a Nobel Peace Prize along with Vice President Al Gore. And joining us on Skype from Washington is Lawrence McDonald, who's with the Center for Global Development. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aisha.
So here's a question, Dan, I'll start with you. Did Sandy become stronger because of climate change?
Well, there is a scientific body of evidence that's related to the kind of conditions that we saw when Sandy was moving up the East Coast. And I think the most important thing to remember is that climate, by definition, is an accumulation of a large number of weather events, and Sandy is just one data point. However, so we like to speak in terms of risk when we talk about Sandy, and there's certainly scientific evidence that heavy precipitation is at a greater risk of occurrence due to climate change. And there is some evidence that warmer sea surface temperatures can increase the risk of stronger storms. So I think that's what you're looking at for the connection.
Okay, so Adil, I'd like to come to you in Lahore. It was a human tragedy, and all human beings are concerned about this tragedy. But other than that, why should people sitting way off in South Asia or in Africa or other parts of the world care?
I think people should care whenever people anywhere get affected by any natural disaster, by any tragedy of any form. People in Pakistan should care about Sandy for the same reason that people in the US should care when a flood hits Pakistan. But more than that, I think when we talk of a global phenomena, then we should care because whether we recognize these lines between countries and these borders and all these things or not, nature does not. A cloudburst does not recognize where the border between Canada and the US ends or one between Pakistan and India ends. And that's the nature of the global climate. That's the nature of global climate change. That's the nature of the type of issues that we are talking about. Now, whether Sandy was or was not directly related to climate change, and we should be very careful about making those causality lines. The fact of the matter is that this is yet one more data point that reminds us how important the global climate is to us. Sandy is not a US event. Storms do not start in countries, they start in the global climate. And that's why the whole globe needs to worry about this, because the global climate, by definition, affects the globe.
Okay, so Lawrence, global climate affects the globe. What I want to ask you is, does the globe, especially some parts of the globe, the developing countries, the underdeveloping countries that the UN says are most vulnerable, the poor, the sick, the elderly, the already suffering are most vulnerable, do they know and do they care?
I think they know, and I think they care, and I think they should know more, and I think they should care more. Certainly Pakistan, because of a series of massive tragedies and especially floods in the last few years, has come to recognize climate change as a very real danger. I do sometimes worry that there is also the danger of misunderstanding the phenomena. And sort of many in Pakistan say, okay, we got the flood because of climate change. Things are not that simple. Things are much more complicated. Climate change becomes one more factor that exacerbates these climatic events. But the reason they know and the reason they are vulnerable is not because the weather system has it against poor people, But poor people, wherever they are the least prepared for and therefore the most vulnerable to any sort of calamity. One of the great lessons that people here in Pakistan are already talking about in terms of Sandy is that you get this massive storm hitting the eastern coast of the United Nations and of the United States, and yet you see that within hours and days, the system is robust enough that people's lives go on. When these things hit a developing country, a place with poor people, the systems aren't, the human systems, the economic systems, infrastructure isn't robust enough for them to sort of bounce back. And that is why developing countries and poor communities should be more worried about climate change as a whole.
Thank you, Adil. Lawrence, I want to come to you for the next question, which is, we talk about how the developing world should care, but it comes back to an old question, and one that I might point out that always ends up in a deadlock every time UN arranges a meeting, which is, who is responsible for what? What is the obligation of the industrialized world versus the rest of the world? Who should pay for what, Lawrence?
There's really no doubt that it's the industrialized world that bears the primary responsibility. Most of the emissions that are currently in the air were produced, not surprisingly, by the countries that industrialized first and increased their emissions of carbon. And I think that my own country, the United States, has been particularly remiss. I sometimes think of us as a pariah nation in that we have the highest per capita emissions of any major country. We also have the highest total emissions, competing there with China more recently. And yet we have been a major impediment to taking action. And I think that's because we've seen it in the debates in the election that we're having, where neither candidate was willing to talk about climate issues, and none of the three debate moderators was willing to ask a question about that. And I think that goes to the influence of lobbyists, the big oil and coal and gas companies on the American political system. They use their money to make sure that this issue does not get raised. And I think if people in Pakistan are going to be interested in Hurricane Sandy, and I hope that they will, it would be to see if this disaster, which is clearly associated with climate and was intensified by climate, is going to change the U.S. political debate. I see some signs that that's happening. It won't happen before Election Day on Tuesday, but I think we're finally reaching the point where our leaders and decision makers are going to have to at least begin to talk about the problem.
Okay, Dan, do you agree with what Lawrence said? And what can people around the world do if the industrialized world doesn't take responsibility? The rest of the world also suffers along with it. It's kind of part of being a global village. We're all in it together. So first of all, where does the debate at US stand? Do you agree with Lawrence? And where do we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly beyond doubt that the industrialized world has emitted the majority of CO2 into the atmosphere. I would add, in the long run, this is going to have to be a global solution, and this is going to include sustainable development and other mechanisms like that that will allow the world to thrive together in a lower emissions future. I would also add that vulnerability is an extraordinarily important concept here. And that's really the biggest takeaway from Sandy, is that Sandy is teaching us about what our vulnerabilities are. And you know, within the United States, these lessons are obviously obvious. But abroad, these type of storms are certainly at higher risk of occurrence in many places in the world. So I think a lot of coastal managers and people and decision makers across the world need to be looking at considering these scenarios when they're making future plans, infrastructure plans.
Okay, we have a very good Facebook comment that might be very relevant here. I want to bring it up. It's Mazhar Ali Kazmi, who writes on our Facebook page, I think industrialization is the main cause that disturbs all things. But he's also asked a question, and I want to go to you guys for the answer. How much is a nuclear bomb testing responsible in global warming? Adil, let me ask you, does it play a major role, that one event?
Probably not. Probably not. It might have had, obviously, sort of anything that throws out emissions, greenhouse gases of any sort, is responsible. But the reason I say that is we really have to take responsibility ourselves. You know who's responsible? You are. You know who's responsible? I am. You know who's responsible? Every time we drive a car, we are. Now, some are more responsible, some are less. Those who have cars are more responsible maybe than those who don't. But in some ways, unless we take on that responsibility, it's most important. But going back to your question, if I might, you asked who should pay. In many ways, I've debated that question my entire life as working on developing countries in this. But now I find that question less and less relevant, because the honest answer is the real question here is not just who should pay, but who will pay. And the answer to that is clear. The poorest people, wherever they are in the world, will end up paying. Climate change hits the poorest the hardest. It hits the poorest the first. And that's not simply because of geography and stuff. Because the poorest in any place, and you can see that with Sandy, you saw that with the Pakistan floods, you see that in every disaster. Wherever the poorest are, they, by virtue of being poor, will be least prepared to tackle with these calamities. The rich will buy sheets for their windows. The rich can move away. The rich can build stronger infrastructure. The rich can do many things. And the poorest will end up paying. Now, this is not, about rich and poor. What this is about is that we have to prepare not only for the question of who caused this, but we have to really prepare for how do we deal with its impacts. And that means moving from a debate on mitigation to a debate on adaptation, and adaptation has to focus on the poorest people in the world, wherever they might be.
Okay, so let me ask my other two guests. Adil says we need to move to the impact and adaptation. I'll start with you, Dan. How do we do that?
Well, I think the first piece is you need to identify what your risks are in your area, and you need to identify cost-effective solutions to reduce those. And in some areas, for example, sea level rise, that's going to involve perhaps larger infrastructure projects. Other things are going to be simply having an emergency response plan and practicing it and carrying out those kind of activities in an effective manner.
So Lawrence, I want to ask you, how do we get adaptation in an economic way so that even the developing world welcomes it as opposed to fearing it?
Well, the climate community always calls this adaptation. I think the word that I prefer and has been used more is resilience. And I think it's important to think in terms of resilience because, as the other two guests who know a lot about this certainly appreciate, we don't just adapt once. There are many tipping points in climate. We probably passed some, we're rapidly approaching others. And we're facing a situation of really runaway change where the thing that we think we might be adapting to, I suspect we'll see in the northeast of my own country an effort to adapt to fend off another storm like Sandy, but the next storm won't be like Sandy. It'll probably be bigger. So we need to build more resilient societies, and I agree with Adil. There's been a lot of discussion about who will pay. Unfortunately, everybody is going to have to pay, and I think that the old debate about unless the rich will provide the South with money to cut emissions and to adapt or improve resilience, that the South wouldn't act. I prefer to turn that on its head, and I'm hoping to see that the global South, including Pakistan, India, Brazil, China, who are most at risk from these impacts, are going to start to say to the North, we insist that you act. Because resilience and adaptation are important, but unless we can rapidly bring down emissions, the changes are of a scale that no society is going to be able to cope with them. So we're in the unfortunate situation. We need money for strengthening our societies, and we also need money for reducing emissions, and it's going to have to come from all of the countries that are part of this problem.
Okay, so there's another Facebook comment that we have, and that kind of makes it more relevant for Pakistan. Adil, I'll come to you for that, which is about the floods that Pakistan had. And the comment is from Malik Imran Rabnawaz, which says, America knows the meaning and the responsibility. He's asking about the floods. Please ask about the Pakistan floods. So, Adil, were the floods in Pakistan in any way, shape or form a result of global warming?
See, I mean, again, I hesitate to respond to sort of the question in a very direct way. You're not going to get calamities that happen only because of climate change. What climate change does is that it increases the probability as well as the scale of climatic disasters. So you're going to likely to see them more. They're going to become more erratic, and they're going to become larger. That doesn't mean that every flood is only because of climate change, and had climate change not happened, there would be no flood. We've been having floods for all of history. We've been having hurricanes for all of history. But what climate change does is that it increases their probability, i.e., you see more of them. It increases their magnitude, that they are likely to become bigger. The worst thing about climate change is that we don't know. It increases the unpredictability of these events. And that is what's really scary. Also, I wanted to sort of get back to some of the earlier debate. You know, if you think about adaptation, how do you do adaptation? Climate adaptation is really about development. One of the interesting things is I lived in Boston, as you know, for 20 years. I've been calling and talking to my friends on the East Coast and you know, trying to make sure they're all okay. And one of the things I hear is, you know, people don't have electricity, power failures, and so on and so forth. Now, people in Pakistan, even without floods, live without power just on a daily basis all year round. They adapt to that. Adaptation is not a good thing. Adaptation essentially means you take on a discomfort, i.e., we call it load shedding, not living without electricity every day. Adaptation is not something we should look forward to, but adaptation is also an opportunity. It is an opportunity to do development in a different way. Give me more development, i.e. sustainable development, and I shall give you a resilient society.
Okay, so you're talking about giving you more sustainable development. That's the question I want to come back to. Lawrence, I want to come to you. With all the problems that we've talked about, and we've talked about quite a few of them, all the problems that we've talked about, how do we get sustainable development that's also economically viable, that competes with the market forces of economy so that people don't have to choose between going sustainable or going the other way?
Well, that's a very big question, and certainly whether societies develop and improve incomes and improve the quality of life is mostly determined by what people in that society do. Pakistan's problems will be addressed by people in Pakistan. They are actively thinking of ways to solve those problems. At my center here, the Center for Global Development, we look at the very small piece of the issue, which is what can outsiders do to get out of the way and occasionally to be more helpful. In terms of development, you know, interestingly, one of the research pieces by my colleague David Wheeler found that educating girls is one of the things that contributes most to climate resilience. The societies that have higher education levels for girls, higher literacy rates, holding all other things, including income, equal, those societies tend to be more flexible and more resilient because, of course, women play a key role both in the home and outside of the home in helping societies to cope. There are many different things that can be done, but I think when we think about how economies can develop, obviously educating girls is a very good thing for economic growth and development. It also turns out it's a very good thing for increasing the resilience of society to climate threats.
Okay, well, so we go from climate change to women's education, which seems to be related even though people don't understand it. Let's come back to, again, sustainable development. And Dan, I want to ask you, after the floods, when the homes were rebuilt, it was said that they were more sustainable. I come back to this issue because this is where it all breaks down to. How much work is being done in the world to provide sustainability at the same cost that people can buy other stuff? Electric cars versus the other cars, or electricity through not coal but water.
Yeah, I think at the same cost is certainly a key part of that. However, I would take the cost picture and expand it. And by building a house that's less sustainable or driving a vehicle that's less sustainable, there's not actually lower cost. That cost is simply being transferred elsewhere. That for a house, that might be a house that's of higher risk, and we know risk has a real cost. For a vehicle, that includes the increased emissions, which results in higher risk throughout the world. So I think we need to expand our thinking of cost beyond simply the out-of-pocket cost to an individual, but instead include the risk cost component and the entire social cost of activities and find a way to accurately price those.
Adil, this brings us to a very interesting issue, which is we're talking about social responsibility here. People don't just think about what they're paying right now, but what the society is paying, what the planet is paying. But that's very difficult to convince people to do when the world economy is like in the dump right now. In Pakistan, inflation is through the roof. In US, the jobless numbers are through the roof. How do you convince people who are paying out of pocket and living paycheck to paycheck to be socially responsible, pay a little bit more now so the planet can survive for another million or billion years?
No, but so let me argue on the other side. First of all, the single best time to do sustainable development is when the economy is in a dump. That is why this is a good time for Pakistan to do sustainable development. And that is why this is a good time for the world to do sustainable development, because when the economy is in a dump, you can do something different. You are in fact compelled to do something different, and therefore you need to be bold. Now, when things are going well, the argument is, why change when everything is so good? The best argument for change is when things are not going well. Second, the argument that sustainable development somehow has to be more expensive than other development is, I'm sorry, but just wrong. It has been wrong for a very long time, and in fact, it's an argument that's been thrust on us by those who never wanted change. The amount of subsidy you have put into the system to give ourselves unsustainable development, take that off and sustainable development becomes cheaper. As was very rightly said, you need to look at the real cost of sustainable development. You can build a cheaper house that will last you 3 years. You can build a much more sustainable house that is going to last you 20 years. Now, if you cost it over 20 years, it's going to be much more sustainable, much more cheaper. That is what, again, that's where the poverty argument comes back. The poor are compelled to live unsustainably because they do not have the resources to make longer-term investments. All of us around this conversation have no excuse because we can make those longer-term investments. So I think the third argument I would like to debunk is that somehow this is about saving the planet and somehow this is about doing social good. No, it is not. This is just about being rational. I don't want the world to save me. I just want people to save themselves. I think sustainable development is doing what is in your own interest when you count all your interests. If we make it an argument about doing good to the world, then unfortunately nothing will happen. That's not how the world moves. So what I'm arguing is, in fact, this is the single best time to do sustainable development. Certainly in Pakistan, I'll talk about energy, right? Pakistan has so little energy that this is the time to invest in the right form of energy. This is the time to think of wind. This is the time to think of solar. Solar at this point competes in Pakistan with hydrocarbon. This is the time to think about not just new types of energy, but conservation of energy. So we need to be much more aggressive and much more proactive in thinking about sustainable development as if it is in our own interest, rather than simply as a slogan about saving the planet.
Okay, so yeah, Lawrence, go ahead. I was coming to you.
Could I step in here?
Yes, please
I certainly agree with Adil about sustainable development and sustainable choices being both more ethical, more moral, and often more economical. But oftentimes, from the individual point of view, they are not. And this is where policy comes into it, and in particular, the ability to emit carbon into the atmosphere. If I have a lovely Cadillac and I drive it, it's a perfectly sound choice for me. It's a very bad choice for everybody else who don't get the benefit of riding in the Cadillac. That's why there has been all of this discussion around cap and trade and putting a price on carbon. And we need to reach an international agreement to price carbon so that those who are producing it, emitting it into the atmosphere currently at zero charge, will be forced to bear some of those costs. And of course, Nick Stern's report, the Stern Review, said that the appropriate price would be about $50 per ton. Right now, we don't have a global price, but it's very much in the interests of poor people in Pakistan and other developing countries that there should be a price because they are emitting very little. And if the rich can be induced to begin to pay for their carbon emissions, that'll generate some of the resources that we need to pay for adaptation, resilience, clean energy, and it'll also give the rich a reason to drastically reduce their emissions. So there's an important policy to this. We're not going to get to that just by saying sustainable development makes sense, let's do it. And I know that is not what Adil is suggesting. I agree with his arguments on sustainable development, but I think that the policy piece of it is extremely important.
You want to jump in here, Dan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the policy piece is really a mechanism to ensure that the costs are being distributed fairly, because the impacts of climate change are certainly being felt by everyone, and it'll simply be more economically efficient if people can actually pay the actual costs.
But this is what Adil said. I want both of you to jump in here. Yes. What he said, if we take away the subsidies for, for the non-sustainable stuff, the cost will be the same. But some of those technologies have developed. So gas prices in the world market, that technology has been developed. So now we probably need to take away subsidies from there and give subsidies to sustainable
well,
technologies?
Certainly, subsidies are a direction that some countries have taken, particularly Germany with their solar industry. But I think there's no real reason to subsidize anything if you're fully accounting for the costs, which includes those socialized costs from increased emissions. In terms of particular political situations in some countries, the subsidy may in fact be the best way to go. But
now, that sounds really good, Dan, but we know this happens with healthcare. We know that people don't account for the cost of health costs when they talk about, sugar or salt or other stuff. So it's not going to happen in an environment that people just think about all the costs. So Lawrence, I want to ask you, would subsidy be a good way for solar energy, for electric energy generation in some way?
Well, I think I agree with Dan on this. What you want to do is change the relative costs. You want the socially positive things, the renewables, the solar and the wind, to become cheaper than coal. There's two ways you can do that. You can raise the price of coal and oil. The first thing you would do is take away their subsidies, if that were politically feasible. And the next thing you would do is tax the emissions. You would force the power generators that burn coal to pay for putting the pollution into the atmosphere. From an economic point of view, those would all be appropriate steps that would not involve subsidies. If you could do either one of those things, you probably wouldn't need the subsidies, because solar and wind are already reaching the point where they're approaching competitiveness with coal, which is the largest source of emissions. Now, if politically you can't withdraw their subsidies and you can't impose a tax on them, then offering a subsidy to renewables, which is what the Obama administration has done here in the United States, that's another way to change relative prices. It's a more expensive way because the taxpayers have to generate the public funds that could have gone to healthcare or could have gone to something else, and you're putting them into energy subsidies. And it's also not politically sure to be protected. We had this relatively minor scandal around Solyndra, the solar producer. It was one of many things that the government had provided a subsidy to. It didn't work out, and it's become a major campaign issue here. So while the Obama administration was correct, and other countries are correct, if they can't eliminate subsidies for pollution, and if they can't tax pollution, then they should subsidize clean energy. They're right. It's kind of a third best. But it's not necessarily politically foolproof. It can leave you open to trouble as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's about all the time we have. We could talk about this topic like forever, and we will probably go on talking about it. I'll probably have you guys over with me. But for now, I want to thank my guest, Adil Najam, joining us from Lahore. He's the Vice Chancellor of Lahore University of Management Sciences. Adil, thank you so much for your time. In our Washington studios, we have Dan Huber, who's with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And we have with us Lawrence McDonald, who's with the Center for Global Development. Thank you all for joining us today. Please come back, and all of you, please remember, you can come to our Facebook, give comments about this particular show. You can also check out more news on our webpage, voanews.com. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye and good night.